Welcome to this opening panel. We are here, as was mentioned, in a historic place, at a historic time, to address a historic topic. The historic place is, of course, this great hall of Ivana Franka University, named after the great Ukrainian poet Ivana Franka. It is the place where, as we've heard, students of international law have studied for many years, including Louis Sohn, whose work infused the UN Charter, Raphael Lemkin, whose work inspired the Genocide Convention, which was adopted 75 years ago tomorrow, and Sir Pact, whose work, An International Bill of the Rights of Man, based on his 1943 lectures, inspired the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly 75 years ago, this coming Sunday, the last day of this conference and summit. That was one of the most important documents in law and has become binding through, as Tracy mentioned, some 80 treaties, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, and so many other things. And so we're here to address the topic of the Universal Declaration at 75 in your hands, building off of Eleanor Roosevelt's famous question, the future of human rights is in your hands. What does the future hold? And there are three ideas that drive this last 2 years of the Ukrainian experience. First, the idea that democracies must defend themselves, as we heard from Professor Riznick, particularly against illegality, aggression, and atrocities. Second, that universal human rights remains the idea of our time, even and perhaps especially when they are under attack. And we are here with you, the international delegation from 14 countries, to share your challenges, including to share your dangers, at the same time as we are here to share your hope. And third, as was expressed in the argument at the International Court of Justice by Ukraine against Russia, Russia's short game is force, but Ukraine's long game is law. How will that be manifested in how the next few years play out? And so we have an extraordinary panel to discuss these subjects from my far right, Sergei Riznick of the Ivana Franka National University of Lviv, who you've heard from
amongst the provisions of international law. And working in the UN for 20 years, I've seen that how these international instruments can be used to bring about changes in national legal systems and to have a long-term effect on the rights of people. Unfortunately, that's the kind of work where you get to meet the many, many people who were inspired by the human rights movement. The human rights movement that came out of UDHR and all of the many people, including people on this panel who have been fighting for human rights for many years, and now we see very painfully the cost at which many people do that. But sitting in Ukraine, you also feel really where the system has fallen short in that if you talk to ordinary Ukrainians, they're not very fond of the UN. They're very disappointed in the power of international law because it doesn't deliver justice fast enough. These institutions, because of the political divisions, they are not delivering, they're not preventing violations, and they're not bringing accountability fast enough. I think even when the declaration was being written, there was a talk about intervention can't be, there won't be interventions to stop human rights violations, but there could be other mechanisms like recommendations, investigations, those will help to bring an end to human rights violations. But there's a lot of people in this room who are involved in investigating, documenting human rights violations, making recommendations about how they should end, but so far it hasn't.
So I can summarize, you said the greatest accomplishments are domestic norm internalization and generational change, but the greatest failure is prevention and enforcement. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so Sarah and Alexander, we'd like to hear your reaction.
Thank you very much. And answering your question, dear professor, and reflecting what my colleague just pointed out, yes, unfortunately, we have to acknowledge that despite all the efforts of the international community during these 75 years since the adoption of the Declaration of Human Rights, its essence continues to be misinterpreted in many countries, especially and also those countries which are members even of the UN Security Council, not only Russia, unfortunately. And this relates to different authoritarian regimes around the world which uphold laws and constitutions, the document which have nothing common with the rule of law, human rights, human dignity, and as Abraham Lincoln, classical quotation, outlined the essence of democracy as government for the people, by the people, and of the people.
If I could just interject, do you think that Putin believes that Russia is not violating human rights? Do you believe that the Russian people believe that? So please make it clear.
And 100 years later, just before, 75 years before Putin, Benito Mussolini stated the same idea which Putin is delivering, I'm sure, that nothing outside the state, above the state, in spite of the state, everything with the help of the state, for the sake of the state, and in the state. So these two opposite approaches still find the expression in national policies.
But are you saying that Russia does not believe in the Universal Declaration, or are you saying they are believing in it, but pretending that they're not violating it?
I'm sure that they, of course, do not believe what they are pretending that they believe, and they are persuading the whole civilized world that they do believe, but we here in Ukraine absolutely are sure that it's fake faith, I would say, and absolutely in this context, it is very worth to remember that during these 35 years, we here in Ukraine saw famines, genocides, revolutions, wars, but we do really still believe in the essence of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And almost all these repressions with values, and their values are false. I'm sure that Russia believes in anti-values, aggression, humiliation, oppression, and these values unite this so-called Russian people.
But sir, what about the Russian people? You're talking about the Russian leadership, you're talking about the Ukrainian people and leadership. What about the Russian people? What about the Russian soldiers who are in the field? Do they believe that they're violating human rights or respecting human rights?
I think, and I hope that my colleagues will agree with me, that the problem is not only in the Russian leadership. It is really a huge problem with Russian so-called people itself, because as I have already mentioned, they are really united by these anti-values. They do not believe in human dignity. They even do not respect their own human dignity. That's why they are so easy losing their lives every day on our territory.
Oh, God.
Thank you. I will turn back to the question of the failures and successes of the Universal Declaration. And as it is said, it's the issue of the values, and the human rights values were established on the universal level and multiplied and codified by the regional instruments. First of all, it's instruments, and they were then introduced in the national legislation. And just for example, more than 130 countries have in their constitutions fixed the human rights exactly related to the Universal Declaration. We have very strong CHR, Institute European Convention on Human Rights, with the mechanism of protection, and
So you're agreeing with Noel, it's domestic and regional.
yeah, it's first of all the implementation of the standards, and well, very crucial is the mutual understanding of these values. That, well, exactly, I refer to Sergei. It's different point of visions what are human rights and how they are considered by these societies and by the, first of all, the leaders, like democratic leaders and autocratic leaders. And here we have not competition, but the battle that now is in Ukraine, and Ukraine is fighting for the values and for the rights that are reflected also in this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And as a practical impact of the 75 years of the adoption of the Declaration, I may tell that now we have the concrete instruments to prove not only human rights violations, but the existing war crimes that are proved by certified, let's say, structures or institutions like UN Inquiry Commission on aggression in Ukraine that collected facts, UN monitoring mission in the grounds. They have the standards elaborated exactly in the Universal Declaration and plus IHL legislation. So here we are, and we are staying on the grounds of these standards, and I think that the common vision helped us to create the resistance to aggressor and to stop the war and to win in this war, because only one and single condition they decided that the Ukrainian population will support them in their actions. And it was strong resistance from the first hours and days and from the first kilometers of Ukrainian territory to Russian army, with the volunteers, with the ordinary people, and civil society relatively is very strong in Ukraine, fighting for these fundamental freedoms and collecting the evidences now and having very different litigation processes in different structures, EC, HR, Human Rights UN Committee, other structures, submissions to the ICC, strong work with the Ukrainian law enforcement structures, and we have, well, the perspectives for the positive result in all the processes. And I think that international society should support this strong cooperation and role of civil society organizations, and to well, introduce the strengthen in the legal protection on all the levels, because now we are dealing with the legal standards and legal rules, and understanding that on the field of the battle should be resolution, but without violation of legal rules. And maybe I...
So you're saying something I think is very important, if I can just summarize. You say that the resistance in Ukraine immediately began around the idea of human rights, and not just local human rights, but universal human rights.
Exactly.
That connected the work of Ukrainian civil society to the work of global civil society. And then you connected it to international law standards and the enforcement of international law standards, which is why we're here today.
Yeah, we are staying on the same standards, and we protect the same values. We see it from the same angle, and thus we need, well, support in our fight, because we fight not only for our values and standards, but for the universal. So it's very simple.
So this makes this a fight not just Russia versus Ukraine,
Yeah.
but Russia versus the global human rights order.
Yeah.
Okay, so our next question then is really about history, and with that we will turn to historian Alita and Fanula. In your program, there is a discussion under this panel about the drafting of the Universal Declaration, that they set out to enumerate basic rights but could not agree where they came from. They could not agree whether there is a God, whether rights belong to individuals or groups. But in the end, they agreed on a declaration that was still clear and powerful. So, Alita, can you tell us more, as someone who has studied this history very closely, what it means for today?
Well, thank you all for tolerating a historian in a room full of lawyers. I promise to be brief, which is a challenge for historians.
And if you're not, I'll cut you off.
I want to make 3 quick points. The first is the Declaration did not originate within the United Nations. It did not originate within Flower Pack's extraordinary work. It had been argued by NGOs and activists, lawyers, and philosophers around the world, beginning from the great disappointment of the First World War, which was the war to end all wars, the wars to make the world safe for democracy, but also gave us poison gas and an inadequately enforced League of Nations and World Court. Okay, the second thing. Michael mentioned early that fear was a major point. I would also argue fear and fury. Now, I want to give you a few numbers just to set the stage. There were 45 million civilians killed, 15 million soldiers killed in the Second World War, 25 million soldiers wounded, 15 million civilians injured, 11 million murdered and tortured in concentration camps, 50+ million people in refugees. Then we have the unimaginable, horrific shadow of the bomb. All this happens while the great powers, point two, are negotiating the Dunbar Notes, the construction of the UN, which totally omits human rights. There is no influence. Countries of the world, led by Latin America, the Philippines, and some early anti-colonial powers in Africa, lead a global pressure to force the drafters of the Dunbar Notes Charter to rewrite the charter and include a very lukewarm reference to human rights, which they then take to San Francisco. San Francisco is where human rights enter the debate. And they enter the debate, not because of the 50+ nations that assembled in San Francisco, but because of the 3,500 observers from 1,000+ NGOs.
So, Alita, we have to get to 1940.
I'm getting there.
Yes,
so that puts it in. So we get to 1948. How does this happen? It happens because I counted the people in the room. The same number of people in this room are the ones who were involved in drafting, editing, shepherding the adoption of the Declaration.
But hold on, why was the Genocide Convention on December 9th? Why was the Universal Declaration on the 10th?
In 5 seconds, because they had not convinced the Russians yet to abstain from the Declaration. And that was Eleanor's job. That was one of her many jobs, was to convince the Russians not to object to the Declaration. The goal was to get it adopted as universally as possible with no objections but abstentions. And so she literally was working around the clock to make sure that as the debate was happening on the floor of the General Assembly, that they would not vote against it.
Well, I think there's a very important point here, which is that the Russians ratified the Genocide Convention. They accepted the dispute settlement clause. They said they would agree to your disputes about interpretation, application, and fulfillment, and that is the basis of Ukraine's suit against Russia at the ICJ. Okay, so make your third point, please.
That the Declaration was a compromise because they could not get a bill adopted. They tried 2 years to adopt an International Bill of Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt, as chair of the committee, understood that that would not happen. She broken-heartedly adopted a strategy that was three-pronged: a declaration, an international bill, and an enforcement mechanism. That would take until 1967 to happen. But the one point that I do want to make, that the last article adopted, and the one that was the most intensely debated, was Article 1, which is all human beings. And, you know, now the popular history says this is about women, okay? In theory, it starts with a debate about women, but it also devolves into a debate about identity, about do children have legal standing, what about racial divisions, what about different religious divisions. You have individual guarantees of those rights, but do they stand in a universal, defining, introductory principle of international law? And they only adopted that 2 days. They adopted it on December 8th, actually today.
But if I can just make a further point, when Hillary Clinton, who has been mentioned, gave her famous speech in Beijing, she said, women's rights are human rights. And then at the UN Human Rights Council in 2013, she said, LGBTQ rights are human rights, which means that the exercise of understanding the scope of these rights just means over time saying that this apparatus protects those rights as well, right? You don't have to change, you don't have to change the declaration to do that.
And the debates show that. I mean, one of the problems with the current histories of the Declaration is they're all based on official, I love the UN documents, but a lot of the UN documents got destroyed in a flood. So in order to really recreate history of negotiations, you have to go to 253 archives in 9 states to assemble the true negotiation strategy. And I know where all those records are, so if you're interested in see me afterwards, and I'll give you the link.
So, Fanula, if you could talk a little bit about impact. You are someone who's worked within the system, you've studied the system, you've been appointed as an expert within the system. You could say that the early phase was one of universalization of norms. A second phase was institutions, creation of institutions. And then a third phase, which began maybe in the 70s, is operationalization of these norms to actually try to have an impact in particular certain situations and with regard to particular sets of issues. How do you see this machine that was developed, including both governments and NGOs, finally coming into operation and functioning as a system, maybe an imperfect system, but one that can impact human rights in real time on the ground?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And I think I'd start by saying that in many ways the power of the Declaration is its evocative power, its imaginative power, its authenticity, it's the actual sheer simplicity of the language of the Declaration. So that I've found over the years, as I have traveled the world, that in the most unexpected places, this language has meaning, even not for lawyers, but for people who have experienced profound violations of their rights. It is intelligible and graspable in ways that many other pieces of our normative framework is not, actually.
But when you're saying it's evocative, you mean it's empowering, it's activating.
It can be, it's both, meaning evocative can be empowering, but in order to be empowering, it's the second piece that you described, which is that it requires, and this is, I suppose, the journey, I think we're on an upward journey where we move from this normative language, and I would say that institutionalization remains fragile. It remains under-resourced, and it remains peripheral in many ways. That's not to say it's not important and it's not enormously powerful, both evocatively and practically. But the operationalization within the UN system, let's just start with budgets, right? We're going to really talk to the translation of the evocative to the practical, which is that human rights constitutes less than 2% of the overall UN budget. And so that's an enormous gap in many countries, including Ukraine, in terms of the realization of those rights. I think the second is, and it goes to Alita's point about where does human rights sit in the institutional structure of the UN, and that goes to geographies. It's very convenient for states that that human rights primarily sits in Geneva, because that's not New York, and that's not the security architecture undermine the normative or moral force of the language of human rights, but it does mean that there is this extraordinary gap between expectation and experience of violation and the capacity of institutions and operationalization to meet. And I think that is the challenge of our time, actually.
So how would you meet it?
How would I take?
How would you meet the challenge? Yeah.
I mean, there's no simple answer to that, but I do think I would start. I would start with we need to, actually it's both a physical gap where human rights sits in the institutional order and where it needs to sit. So this Geneva, New York, we use the UN kind of analogy, the continuum, we need to move, we need to shift to that. That's an intersectional.
And how would you do that?
I mean, I might close down Geneva. I mean, I see us in an extraordinary, I mean, we know that.
How would Ukraine have done without Geneva?
Ukraine would do better if Geneva was in New York.
No, you're agree.
Let me approach it this way, that there is, you know, first I want to start with what you said on the practical power of human rights. Yesterday I was in the POW camp that's outside of Lviv. And when I walked in the building, on the left-hand side, oh, sorry. When I walked into the building, on the left, was several articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Ukrainian. They didn't have room to give all of the whole declaration on the board. So they left out a couple of articles. And they left out one that I think is important, it relates to what you're saying, which is Article 28. I don't know the history of Article 28, maybe you'll tell us about that. But the right to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully recognized. So, yeah, this is missing, the right to an international order in which these rights can be recognized. I don't know what exactly needs to change in the international order so that the rights can be recognized, but this is a part of the declaration, and you're going to help me understand that part of it.
But now, the fact that these words are written there, do you think that's inspirational to the refugees or depressing to the refugees?
These are prisoners of war, where I was yesterday. I think it's important that everybody that they also have an understanding that even in their condition, and they get copies of the Third Geneva Convention, they see the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is a different culture in which
You're saying they realize they have rights. They're participants in their own fate. They're not just objects of governmental depredation. They are agents. They have human agency. That's the point. They're not inert. Yes, please.
In a different universe, I work with torture survivors with the organization that Michael mentioned at the start. I've done this for almost 20 years, and I have never met a survivor who has not clung to the hope of the Declaration. I mean, I've had people bring bloodied ID cards that they kept from when they were tortured for supporting the Declaration. I agree that the Declaration is evocative. I think what we need on every major level is the courage to promote it with a fierceness and a determination that both keeps us at the table, but also shows that we are not going to walk away and water it down. Everybody in this room works to execute the law and to build systems. I work to help people support the law and to understand what law is in over 26 different countries.
But Alita, when you say say that they have this document in their hands, bloody, etc.? I'm asking,
it's not going to work.
what do you take from that? That they consider it an unfulfilled promise that they have a right to pursue?
I think if they have not embraced their courage back, they look at it as an unfulfilled promise. If they have found their courage back, it is the issue to which they will dedicate their lives. And, you know, to be a historian for 15 seconds, progress does not happen overnight. It's a rubber band. It goes like this and comes back, and goes like this and comes back, and it comes and snaps you in the face. And the way to make it work is not to give up. Now, I'm a cockeyed optimist on this panel. I totally get it. But I firmly believe that if we figure out how to stand tall for the Declaration, not only in ourselves, but in small places close to home, enforce our governments, then we can, outside the law, help the law become more powerful.
So I can quote a historian who wrote me an email about this. Her name is Alita Black. She said, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a standard of behavior, a call to action, a work in progress, a measure of our courage and character. I assume you agree with that.
Yeah, I do.
All right, so let's return to Ukraine, Stoyati, and Alexander. You've heard from Fanula the thought that the UN system is not working for Ukraine. What would moving forward from where we are
human dignity. And for Ukrainians, it is really a very strong statement. It's not like meaningful phrase or something like that. We really do believe. And this is a big difference between us and Russians, Belarusians, and other so-called societies.
So you're essentially saying
Sorry?
Russia's game is force, Russia's game is violence, Russia's game is atrocities, Russia's game is aggression, Ukraine's game is law, human rights, belief in a better way.
But we have to be strong as well, because without strength, without power, only this face of force is not effective. We also understand this very well. And the power line show that the main stakeholder of this power is Ukrainian people, because peoples fight against internal dictatorships, and they can win external dictatorships. That's what our people today is showing to the whole world.
Alexander, what's your view on this situation from your experience?
I will say briefly, human rights should not only be respected but also protected, and the means of protection should be well established and here I see the very concrete solution on the bringing to justice the war crimes or the crimes for aggression crimes should be established at international level. And now we have procedures with the ICC, but it's actual international humanitarian law. The institutionalizations of the processes of protection of human rights on regional and international level, I think now is the challenge for the world. And it should strengthen national judiciary, because on the level of national judiciary, such rights should be, let's say, properly protected according to the international standards. And Ukraine has very good experience since 1997, the ratification of European Convention for Human Rights and the case law that was properly introduced, and now we have even, well, as I see, the very single law on execution of the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights on national level, so it's a very solid case. But it means that Ukraine is following these obligations to protect the human rights, the rule of law principles, and now we are here for standing for rule of law, our fourth conference. And I think that the understanding what is the rule of law and what is inside of rule of law, and the core factor of rule of law is human rights as well. I think that this is the part of or the value that is behind Ukraine as a state that now, let's say, fighting for these values on the field of the battle. And finalizing, just I may repeat that the possible institutionalization of this mechanism or institutes of instruments on international level will bring more concrete impacts on the protection on national level, and it will bring more development.
So let me ask both you answer. For more than 30 years, since Ukraine became independent, one of the great criticisms, both inside and outside, is corruption. Do you think that the institutions, the rule of law institutions of Ukraine, have gotten stronger
core issue, the strong and independent judiciary that should be established and functioning in the country. We are underway. We are not with the final and positive results, but still the process is going on. And I think that we are, let's say, far and more developed when we may compare what was Ukraine, for example, 30 years ago, and what is Russia, that we've stayed from the same state. We started from the same state. And yeah, it's the challenge that should be overcome, and I think that it's not should be neglected the factor of negative factor of the society and the influence on the many sides of the life. Still, we have to look into the strengthening of this instrument of independent instruments. First of all, judiciary and all institutions of judiciary. Thank you.
Sir, and Noel, I'd like you to comment on what we've heard from these two surveys.
Thank you very much. I agree completely with Alexander. Of course, this fight with corruption is still going on. Of course, we have also institutional guarantees. We have higher anti-corruption authority, which is very active, and we see its decisions almost every day combating corruption, which is of course one of the most ambitious in use of powers. But I just want to point out one thing. In this fight, Ukrainian today's political leadership, the Ukrainian people and international partners, especially from the American side, are together in this fight with corruption. And we will finish it up.
Noel, before we get, when does the session end?
5 minutes ago.
I'm not asking you.
Take a little extra time here, you got a late start.
I would just add to what the colleagues have said on the rule of law and corruption, that the whole reform that the colleagues talked about of the judiciary and the systems for protection for the rule of law. But there's also a very strong civil society that has kept this in the public eye even as the war has been going on, and a willingness to call the government to account. So yes, Ukrainian civil society continues to make noise about it, continues to hold the government to account, even during a time of war when criticizing the government may be more difficult because there is a need for people to be united. But on this issue, the Ukrainians are firm; they will not stand.
So, Fanula, 75 years ago, these rights are set forward. There are obviously things not mentioned, the environment, the internet. If an addendum was being done today, what should be added?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think that's extraordinary about this, when I was rereading the declaration for this conference, I was struck by the cadence of the word everyone, all, no one. So I think about there's almost a poetic quality, but those words do a lot of work in actually compensating for what's left out. Right? So one of the, I think, quite extraordinary things about this document is that, of course, one can think about an addendum, but it's one of, I think, unusually one of the documents that's capable of this stretch that in many ways we would struggle to do with other documents, and there in some ways lies its power, because these days I have an extraordinary fear of opening up any document, right? Any document, charter, Geneva Convention, any document, and I would include the Universal Declaration of that. But maybe there are two things that I would speak to. And one is just, as we think with this conference happening, there's also another conference happening, the COP conference is happening, and we've had in the last year the recognition both by the General Assembly and by the Human Rights Council that there exists a human right to a clean and healthy environment. And it's worth remembering too one place where I think the vocabulary of the Declaration falls short as we look beyond war and confront the polycrisis that
But what about artificial intelligence? Are drones respecting our human rights?
It's a really, I mean, I was thinking about when we talked about these questions earlier, and I was thinking about, well, where's the other place? And the other place, of course, is technology. And one of the things that has struck me enormously in the last couple of years of my own work is the way in which, in some ways, a right to privacy, which I view as a gateway right to other rights. I think in some ways, we have to rethink our hierarchy of rights, where historically we might think of privacy as a lesser right, as a right that could be seceded in a way, including through derogation. And now I think we actually, in the context of surveillance capitalism, surveillance, artificial intelligence, biometric data collection, everyone who got on a plane handed over their API and their PNR as they got here, because somebody has your data. But there I actually do think a re-articulation of privacy, which we do find, it's there in the Declaration, but I think as a human rights community, as an international community, we have done insufficient work on articulating the centrality of privacy to the protection of human dignity in a new technological.
But most of it is compelled. We accept all cookies. If you're dealing with your computer, it's forcing you to give up your privacy to use the resources of the internet. So what do we do about that?
Well, I'd say two things. One is I think we have a fundamental lack of regulation. Drones is a really good example. There was a window and we missed it, and now it's obviously not a compromisable space for many states. We're right on the cusp of that in relation to artificial intelligence. We're certainly on the cusp of that in relation to biometric data collection. And so, in some sense, I think it requires this recentering of our relationship. And that, in a way, goes back to an understanding, a human understanding of what you give up when you actually click that or you enable that. And again, to me, it fundamentally goes back to a reordering of privacy and a reordering of the relationship between the human person and technology. And we miss that both in a lack of regulation, a fundamental lack of call for regulation, as well as, I think, an under-articulation of the space for human dignity in the lack of regulation.
So let me ask the last question for each member of the panel. You can pick one. Eleanor Roosevelt, and I picked that for you, Alita. Raphael Lemkin, Hersch Lauterbach, Louis Sohn, or you can pick somebody else from 75 years ago. If they were here today with us on this 75th anniversary, what would be their message to this group? Sergey, I assume you want to speak about Lemkin or Lauterbach, two graduates of this school.
Thank you very much, Harold. I will be very short. Of course, I have to choose it. I want to choose two, then if I may, Hersch Lauterbach and Raphael Lemkin. Not only because they were graduating students of Єльського school, but really for the Ukrainians, it is one of ties with the international community. And for the last 5 years, me here first as a professor of constitutional law, then as a vice rector for international relations, I felt and saw how much these two professors made for Ukraine this year. And I'm sure that if they were alive today, the impact has been much more better. But this is as well enough, and for the university, and for Ukraine, and for international law, its future, and of course, Lemkin, Lauterbach, my choice.
Noel.
I think what strikes me most is how this generation of people who lived 75 years ago and lived through all of the horrors of the Second World War and the First World War, I mean, how if they were here in our time, they would, I mean, their wording would be that were very, very dangerous times, and it took people time to apprehend that. And I think these are all people who learned to apprehend and to build try to build the institutions and protections that would prevent it again. So I think they would say, keep your eyes open, and those are dangerous times.
I'll leave it.
I'll cite two Eleanor documents. The first is the last sentence she ever wrote before she died, other than a thank you note, which is staying aloof is not a solution, it is a cowardly invasion. And she wrote that in response to America's position in engaging on human rights defense around the world. The second thing is structural, and I say this because everybody thinks of Eleanor as a mushy-headed liberal rather than somebody who understood systems. And in 1961, she becomes very concerned about the structure of the Security Council and, in fact, how other voices will be held. So I think she would speak out about the P5 controlling the human rights agenda, argue that there would be enforcement capabilities given to the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and encourage everyone to act because, as she would say, you know, we cannot leave our problems to the government, we are the government.
And, well, so today is the first day of Hanukkah, and so those who celebrate Hanukkah have Sameach, so it's worth remembering on the holiday of light. That both Lemkin and Ladopak were Jewish scholars who survived the Holocaust. And that's a really important part of understanding what drove their scholarship and their commitments. And so I'll quote Lemkin in that regard, which is, he said, genocide is not war, it's more dangerous than war. But maybe to close with an Irish poet, Seamus Heaney, who also said, even in the worst of times, there is light. So he said, once in a lifetime, a long time tide wave of justice can rise up, and hope in history rhymes. So maybe we're in a moment of hope in history.
Well, I just remind the words of Winston Churchill, who said that never again is the motto to create a new system of protection of human rights in Europe. But never again we see that the war is again in Europe. So my question is to distinguish how to introduce this strong instrument that will really protect the population on the earth against the war, and that never again became the strong motto. And very particular issue, the presence of, for example, Russian representative in Security Council, which is a big mistake. How to avoid these mistakes and how to create a system that